When a millionaire pushes his black Maid to sing, expecting her to fail, her extraordinary voice shocks everyone, shifting the event's atmosphere and humiliating him. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The grand ballroom of Harold Kensington's mansion buzzed with activity as the city's elite filtered through its ornate doors. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over marble floors, while waiters in pristine uniforms weaved through clusters of well-dressed guests carrying silver trays of champagne. Harold stood at the center of it all, a glass of aged scotch in his manicured hand, his custom-made Italian suit setting him apart from even this wealthy crowd. "And that's how I close the Morrison deal," Harold announced to a circle of captivated investors, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone used to commanding attention. $15 billion in acquisitions, gentlemen. The largest hostile takeover in the industry's history. He paused for effect, savoring the impressed murmurs from his audience. Each nod of approval fed his already inflated ego. In a corner of the vast room, Lyla Johnson stood quietly arranging flower vases, her uniform marking her as part of the serving staff. Yet there was something in her posture that suggested she didn't quite belong there, a quiet dignity that contrasted with her surroundings. Her hands moved methodically, but her eyes occasionally darted to the gathering crowd, studying them with a mix of apprehension and determination. Harold's booming laugh drew her attention. He was now regaling his guests with stories of his latest yacht purchase. "Money is power, my friends," he declared, swirling his scotch. "And power is about knowing how to keep people in their proper place." His eyes deliberately swept across the serving staff, lingering momentarily on Lyla. The party's atmosphere shifted as Harold, riding high on his own self-importance, decided to create some entertainment at Lila's expense. He had overheard her singing in the kitchen earlier that week and saw an opportunity to assert his dominance while amusing his guests. "Lyla," he called out, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. The room quieted as heads turned toward the serving staff corner. "I hear you fancy yourself a singer. Why don't you give us a little performance?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. "I'm sure my guests would love to be entertained." The surrounding socialites exchanged knowing glances, already anticipating the humiliation that was sure to follow. Harold turned to them with a smirk. "Don't worry about being too generous with your applause. We wouldn't want to give anyone false hopes about their station in life." Lyla stood frozen for a moment, her hands gripping the edge of a serving tray. The weight of dozens of judgmental stares pressed down on her. But something stirred in her expression, a flash of defiance, a straightening of her spine. She had spent years in church choirs, finding her strength through gospel music. This moment, though meant to humiliate her, could be something else entirely. Setting down her tray with deliberate care, Lyla stepped forward. The clicking of her practical shoes on marble echoed in the suddenly hushed room. Harold's smirk widened as she approached the small stage area where a piano stood. He expected her to falter, to prove his point about the natural order of things. What he didn't see was the fire building behind her eyes, the years of practice and passion that were about to be unleashed. As Lyla took her position on stage, her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation, some guests already preparing their polite, dismissive applause. Little did they know that this moment, orchestrated for cruel entertainment, was about to become a turning point in all their lives. Lyla's finger, trembled slightly, but her resolve was ironclad. She had spent her life being underestimated, and now, in this opulent ballroom, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than part of the furniture, she was about to show them exactly who she was. The first note that left Lyla's lips silenced every whisper in the room. Her voice, rich and powerful, filled the space with an intensity that caught everyone off guard. The crystal glasses seemed to vibrate with each sustained note, and the previously dismissive guests found themselves frozen in place, champagne flutes suspended halfway to their mouths. Clara Morrison, known in social circles for her carefully curated image and endless charity galas, stood near the grand windows. Her perfectly maintained facade cracked as Lyla's voice washed over her. She had spent decades attending performances at the Metropolitan Opera, but something about this impromptu song struck deeper than any professional production she'd witnessed. Her manicured hands began to tremble, and for the first time in years, she felt something genuine stir within her chest. Across the room, James Patterson, Harold's longtime legal counsel and confidant, shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather shoes. The song's lyrics about struggle and perseverance hit too close to home. He thought about the countless times he'd turned a blind eye to Harold's questionable business practices, the settlements he'd arranged to silence wronged employees, the moral compromises that had built his career. Each verse seemed to strip away another layer of his carefully constructed justifications. Harold's reaction shifted from smug anticipation to barely concealed anger. He watched as his guests, people he thought he knew and controlled, transformed before his eyes. The usual social masks began to slip, revealing genuine emotion, something he had always viewed as a weakness. He tried to catch someone's eye, to share a knowing look of mockery, but found no allies. Every face was turned toward Lyla, transfixed. The song built in intensity, and the atmosphere in the room grew thicker with unspoken tensions. Several guests dabbed at unexpected tears, while others stood rigidly, fighting against the emotions threatening to break through their practiced composure. The evening had veered dramatically off Harold's planned course, and he could feel his grip on the situation loosening. Clara found herself moving closer to the makeshift stage, drawn by an inexplicable force. Her usual spot among the social elite at these gatherings suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. She watched Lila's face as she sang, seeing not the servant she had barely noticed before, but a woman of extraordinary strength and talent. The realization of her own prejudices hit her like a physical blow. James loosened his tie, feeling suffocated by more than just the formal attire. Each line of the song seemed to echo through his conscience, forcing him to confront the disparity between his younger self's ideals and the man he'd become. He glanced at Harold, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time, not as a powerful friend, but as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his own moral journey. The connection forming between the guests was palpable. People who had spent years engaging in superficial conversation at similar events found themselves sharing genuine looks of understanding. The invisible barriers of wealth and status that usually divided the room began to waver and crack under the weight of Lila's voice. Harold attempted to regain control, moving through the crowd with forced cheerfulness, but his presence no longer commanded the same attention. His guests, usually so attuned to his every mood and whim, barely registered his passage. The power dynamic had shifted, and he felt it slipping through his fingers like fine sand. As Lila's song continued to fill every corner of the vast room, the transformation of the atmosphere was undeniable. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, the possibility of change, of connection, of truth. The very foundations of their social hierarchy trembled, threatening to collapse under the weight of authentic emotion and forced self-reflection. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate had become something far more dangerous to Harold's carefully constructed world. In trying to put Lyla in her place, he had inadvertently given her a platform to challenge everything he had built his life around. The music continued to weave through the room, binding the listeners together in an unexpected shared experience that would prove impossible to ignore or forget. The crescendo of Lila's song reached its peak, her voice soaring to heights that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. Clara Morrison, overcome by the moment, rose from her seat in a sudden, unplanned movement. Her hands came together in applause before the song had even finished, breaking every rule of high society etiquette she'd followed for decades. One by one, other guests joined her, creating a wave of genuine appreciation that swept through the room. Harold's face contorted with a mix of emotions. Anger blazed in his eyes, while shame colored his cheeks crimson. He moved forward, one hand raised as if to signal for silence, but his gesture went unnoticed. For the first time in his mansion, he had become invisible. The very people who normally hung on his every word now stood transfixed, their attention completely captured by the woman he had intended to humiliate. "Enough," he tried to say, but his voice was drowned out by the swelling applause. A waiter brushed past him without the usual deferential bow, caught up in the moment. Harold grabbed for his arm, but James stepped between them, shaking his head slightly. The warning in his old friend's eyes was clear. Any attempt to stop this would only damage Harold's reputation further. Clara's tears flowed freely now, streaking her expensive makeup. She had attended countless performances in venues across the world, but never had she felt so genuinely moved. The carefully constructed walls around her emotions, built through years of society marriages, charity galas, and superficial friendships, crumbled under the weight of Lyla's authenticity. Her hands trembled as she clapped, each tear representing a crack in her perfectly maintained facade. The applause thundered through the ballroom, bouncing off marble floors and mahogany panels. It wasn't the polite, measured applause of society functions, but something raw and real. People who had spent their lives restraining their emotions now found themselves caught up in a moment of pure, unfiltered appreciation. Lyla's final note hung in the air, resonating with a power that seemed to vibrate through everyone's chest. As her voice faded, the applause grew even louder. Guests who had never acknowledged serving staff as anything more than moving furniture now stood in ovation, their expensive jewelry catching the light as their hands came together again and again. Harold tried once more to regain control of his party. He stepped toward the makeshift stage, his mouth opening to deliver some dismissive comment that would reset the social order. But before he could speak, Clara's voice rang out clear and strong. "Magnificent. Absolutely magnificent." Her words, carrying the weight of her social standing, effectively silenced any attempt Harold might have made to diminish the moment. The triumph shining in Lyla's eyes struck Harold like a physical blow. She stood straight-backed on the stage, accepting the applause with a dignity that made his earlier condescension seem small and petty. The power dynamic in the room had shifted seismically, and he felt the ground of his social authority crumbling beneath his feet. Clara made her way through the crowd toward the stage, her determination evident in every step. Other guests followed in her wake, drawn by her example and their own awakened emotions. The invisible barrier between server and served dissolved as people who had spent their lives maintaining social hierarchies found themselves reaching out to congratulate a maid. The scene unfolding in Harold's ballroom defied everything he had built his world upon. Status, wealth, social position. All the markers he used to measure worth seemed suddenly hollow in the face of genuine talent and authentic emotion. He watched helplessly as his carefully orchestrated evening transformed into something beyond his control or understanding. Lyla's performance had done more than entertain. It had cracked the veneer of social pretense, forcing everyone in the room to confront their own humanity. As the applause continued, the atmosphere crackled with the energy of awakening consciences and shifting perspectives. What started as a cruel attempt at entertainment had become a catalyst for change, though none of them yet realized just how far-reaching that change would be. As the applause finally began to subside, Lyla stepped forward to the edge of the stage. The confidence from her performance still radiated from her, but now mixed with something more vulnerable. She gripped the microphone, her work-worn hands visible to all, and began to speak. "Music saved my life," she said, her voice carrying the same authenticity as her song. "I grew up in foster homes, cleaning houses at 16 to survive. The only constant was the church choir." The room fell into absolute silence. These weren't the usual platitudes guests were used to hearing at charity galas. This was raw truth infiltrating their insulated world. Uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several guests shifted in their seats, suddenly aware of their Cartier watches and Hermes ties. These were people accustomed to discussing poverty through the safe distance of fundraiser statistics, not facing it in the form of someone standing before them. James Patterson stood up, his legal pad abandoned on his lap. 20 years of defending corporate interests had trained him to control narratives, but Lyla's words stripped away his professional detachment. "I've spent my career," he began, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady, justifying things I knew were wrong, writing contracts that protected wealth while crushing opportunity. Harold's face darkened. This wasn't just a servant stepping out of line anymore. This was his trusted lawyer, his friend, publicly breaking ranks. He moved toward James, but the crowd had become a barrier, people standing shoulder to shoulder, engaged in something he couldn't control. "We talk about merit," James continued, gaining strength, "about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But we've rigged the game. Every contract I've written, every deal I've structured, they're all designed to keep power where it already exists." His words hit the room like stones dropping in still water, creating ripples of discomfort and recognition. The crowd's reaction split like a fault line. Some guests, particularly the younger ones, nodded in agreement. Others, mostly older board members and their wives, drew back in obvious disapproval. The comfortable numbness of wealthy isolation began to crack under the weight of unwanted truth. Harold finally pushed his way through to James. "That's enough," he hissed, grabbing his friend's arm. "You're drunk. You're embarrassing yourself." But James pulled away, standing straighter than he had in years. "No, Harold. For the first time in decades, I'm thinking clearly." James turned to address the room again. "We sit in boardrooms deciding the fates of thousands, congratulating ourselves on our business acumen. But have any of us spent a day in the shoes of those we impact? Have we ever really listened to voices like Lyla's?" The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Guests who had known each other for years found themselves on opposite sides of an invisible divide. The usual social masks began to slip, revealing genuine emotions: discomfort, guilt, anger, hope. Lyla remained on stage, watching this unfold. Her presence had become a catalyst, forcing these privileged people to confront realities they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. Some couldn't meet her eyes, while others stared with a new awareness that bordered on revelation. Harold attempted to regain control of the situation, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is hardly the time or place for social commentary. We're here to enjoy ourselves, not listen to lectures from." He trailed off, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on him, judging his every word. The energy in the room had transformed completely. What began as a typical evening of wealthy self-congratulation had become something dangerous to the established order. The very air seemed charged with the possibility of change, making those invested in the status quo increasingly nervous. Through it all, Lyla stood her ground. The same quiet dignity that had infused her singing now anchored her in place as the storm of social upheaval swirled around her. She had become more than just a servant who dared to sing. She was now a mirror forcing everyone in the room to examine their own reflections. The elegant ballroom, with its gold leaf ceiling and crystal chandeliers, transformed into an unlikely forum for social discourse. Conversations erupted in every corner, no longer about stock portfolios or summer homes, but about privilege, responsibility, and change. The carefully maintained veneer of polite society cracked wide open. "My father was a factory worker," admitted Benjamin Sterling, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, his voice shaking slightly. "I've spent 20 years pretending I came from old money, changing my accent, hiding my past." He stood near the refreshment table, his admission drawing shocked looks from his peers. "We all pretend we earned everything we have, but how many doors were opened for us while being slammed shut for others?" The revelation sparked a chain reaction. Sarah Whitmore, a prominent philanthropist, stepped forward. "My foundation gives millions to education programs, but we've never once hired from the communities we claim to help." Her words carried across the room, heavy with self-realization. "We write checks and feel good about ourselves, but we keep our distance from the actual people we're supposed to be helping." Harold watched in mounting fury as his carefully curated social gathering unraveled. These were conversations that weren't supposed to happen in his home, among his circle. Yet he found himself increasingly isolated as the dialogue continued without his direction or control. Clara, who had been deeply moved by Lyla's performance, now stood directly in front of Harold. Her usual diplomatic smile was gone, replaced by an expression of fierce determination. "How dare you?" she demanded. her voice carrying the weight of decades of accumulated guilt. How dare you try to humiliate someone for your entertainment? Someone who has shown more genuine talent and courage than I've seen in all our years of society gatherings. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to this confrontation. Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. We've all been complicit in this game of pretense and privilege, but tonight Lyla showed us something real. And instead of embracing that reality, you tried to crush it. Harold attempted to dismiss her with a wave of his hand. Clara, you're being dramatic. This is hardly the venue for dash. No, Clara cut him off, surprising even herself with her vehemence. This is exactly the venue. In this room, right now, are people with the power to actually change things. Real power, not just the power to write charity checks and feel good about ourselves. The conversation spread like wildfire through the room. A young hedge fund manager spoke up about predatory lending practices in low-income neighborhoods. A real estate developer acknowledged how zoning laws were manipulated to maintain segregation. Each confession seemed to embolden others to speak their truths. Lyla observed this transformation with a mixture of hope and caution. She had seen too many moments of apparent awakening fade into nothing more than feel-good memories. But something felt different about this night. The raw honesty in the room had a weight to it, a substance that couldn't easily be dismissed. Harold made one last attempt to regain control. This is all very touching, he announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But let's not forget who we are. We're the ones who build this economy, who create the jobs, who benefit from a system designed to keep people like Lyla serving us instead of sharing their gifts with the world. James interrupted, his legal training giving extra weight to his words. We're not job creators, Harold. We're gatekeepers. And tonight, someone just showed us exactly what we've been keeping out. The momentum of truth-telling continued to build. People who had spent their lives avoiding uncomfortable realities now found themselves engaged in profound discussions about inequality, opportunity, and responsibility. The artificial boundaries of social class that usually define such gatherings began to dissolve in the face of genuine human connection. Through it all, the tension continued to build. This wasn't just a momentary breach of social etiquette. It was the beginning of something that threatened the very foundations of their privileged world. And as the evening progressed, it became increasingly clear that there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance of before. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from theoretical discussion to practical action. Lyla stood at the center of this transformation, watching as these powerful individuals began converting their newfound awareness into tangible commitments. Her simple performance had triggered an avalanche of change that even she hadn't anticipated. I own 17 empty buildings in the city's poorest neighborhoods, announced David Chun, a real estate developer who had been silent until now. He pulled out his phone, hands slightly shaking. I've been sitting on them, waiting for property values to rise. Tomorrow, I'm calling my lawyers. We're converting them into affordable housing and community centers. The declaration was met with murmurs of approval, but David wasn't finished. And I want Lyla to help decide how these spaces can best serve her community. James Patterson, still standing, seized the moment. His legal pad now filled with rapid notes. He addressed the room with the same conviction he usually reserved for courtroom arguments. We need to formalize this momentum, he declared. I'm proposing the creation of a foundation, not another tax haven disguised as charity, but a genuine vehicle for change. Full transparency, community leadership, and real resources. The room buzzed with energy as more people stepped forward with concrete offers. A tech CEO pledged to create a coding academy in underserved neighborhoods. A university board member promised to overhaul admission policies. Each commitment built upon the last, creating a cascade of potential change. Lyla observed this unfolding scene with a complex mixture of emotions. Her voice had opened this door, but she understood the gap between wealthy promises and actual follow-through. Yet something in the intensity of the moment, in the way these people were dropping their practice facades, gave her hope that this time might be different. I want to be clear about something. Lyla spoke up, her voice carrying the same strength it had during her song. I'm not here to be your token success story or your path to redemption. If you're serious about change, it needs to be systematic and sustainable. The room fell silent, hanging on her words. Your guilt isn't enough. Your money isn't enough. We need your commitment to dismantling the very systems that made you powerful. James approached Lyla, extending his hand, not in condescension, but in partnership. Would you consider taking a leadership role in this foundation? Not as a figurehead, but with real decision-making power. The question hung in the air, weighted with significance. This wasn't just about one night of awakened consciousness. It was about restructuring power itself. The party had transformed into an impromptu planning session. Groups formed throughout the room, with people who normally discussed yacht purchases now debating the mechanics of social change. Phones emerged as contact information was exchanged, commitments were documented, and initial meetings were scheduled. A group of younger guests, primarily tech entrepreneurs and inheritors of family wealth, clustered around Lyla. They weren't asking for absolution or photo opportunities. They were asking detailed questions about community needs, systemic barriers, and effective intervention strategies. Their privileged educations were being redirected from profit-making to problem-solving. Harold watched from the margins as his carefully maintained power structure crumbled. The very people he had cultivated as allies were now reorganizing themselves around a new center of gravity, one that explicitly challenged his worldview. His attempt to humiliate a servant had instead elevated her to a position of genuine influence. The evening's energy crystallized into something tangible as James began collecting formal pledges. Numbers were discussed, not in terms of tax-deductible donations, but in terms of substantial commitments of capital and resources. The foundation wasn't just an idea anymore. It was taking shape in real time, with real money and real power behind it. Through it all, Lyla maintained her composure, neither overwhelmed by the sudden attention nor swayed by the extravagant promises. She had spent too many years observing these people from the margins to be easily convinced. But she recognized the potential of this moment, the possibility that her voice might open doors for others who had been similarly silenced. Harold Kensington stood alone near his prized Rembrandt, watching his world reorganize itself without him. The same people who had laughed at his jokes hours earlier now avoided his gaze, creating a bubble of isolation around him. His fingers gripped his crystal tumbler so tightly it threatened to crack. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical force. Every snide comment, every casual dismissal, every moment of cruelty he had justified as maintaining standards played back in his mind. He watched as his carefully cultivated network of influence dissolved, reforming around Lyla and the promise of change she represented. You know what the worst part is, Harold? James approached him, speaking softly so only Harold could hear. You actually believed your own lies. You convinced yourself that your wealth made you superior, that your privilege was earned. Tonight showed everyone, including you, just how hollow that belief was. James didn't wait for a response, turning away to rejoin a group discussing implementation strategies for the new foundation. Across the room, Clara and Lyla sat together on a velvet settee, their heads bent in intense conversation. The sight would have been unthinkable hours earlier. The society didn't and the maid talking as equals. Clara's perfectly manicured hand rested on Lyla's arm as they shared stories of their lives. I was so trapped, Clara confided, her usual polish cracking to reveal genuine emotion. Every charity ball, every board meeting, every carefully orchestrated social event. It was all just an elaborate performance. Your song made me realize I haven't felt real in decades. Tears threatened to ruin her expensive makeup again. But for the first time in her adult life, Clara didn't. She cared about maintaining appearances. Lyla listened with the same attention she had given to fellow choir members in her church, offering neither judgment nor easy absolution. Change isn't about feeling guilty, she responded carefully. It's about recognizing your power and choosing to use it differently. You have connections, influence, access. These aren't things to be ashamed of. They're tools that can be used for real change. Around them, the party had evolved into something unprecedented. Small groups huddled in corners, planning and strategizing. a young software billionaire, was explaining blockchain technology to a community organizer Lyla had invited, discussing ways to ensure transparent fund management. A real estate mogul and a civil rights attorney debated zoning laws and community displacement, finding common ground in their desire for equitable solutions. The energy in the room had transformed from the initial emotional breakthrough to something more substantial, a commitment to concrete action. People who had spent their lives competing for status and influence now collaborated, pooling their resources and expertise toward a common goal. Harold watched as his own brother, Thomas, joined a group discussing educational initiatives. Thomas had always been the family disappointment, too concerned with social justice to focus on profit. Now, suddenly, his decades of experience in community work made him a valuable voice in the room. The irony was not lost on Harold. Clara stood up, smoothing her designer dress more out of habit than concern for appearance. "I need to make some calls," she announced to Lyla. "There are people who should be part of this. People with influence who've been waiting for a catalyst like this." She paused, then added with a hint of her old social authority. "And darling, you simply must come to dinner next week. My entire circle needs to hear you speak." The transformation of the evening was perhaps most evident in the staff. The other servers, initially shocked by Lyla's performance, now moved through the room with new confidence. They joined conversations, offered insights, shared their own stories. The invisible barrier between servant and served had not just been breached, it had been dismantled. Harold's isolation grew more pronounced as the evening progressed. His attempts to catch someone's eye, to draw them into his orbit with the gravitational pull of his wealth, failed repeatedly. He had always seen power as a zero-sum game. If others gained influence, he must be losing it. Now, watching the spontaneous collaboration around him, he began to understand just how much his worldview had cost him. The same room that had witnessed countless displays of wealth and status now hummed with a different kind of energy. Plans were being made, alliances were forming, and at the center of it all stood Lyla, not as a symbol or a token, but as a leader whose authentic voice had awakened something long dormant in these privileged hearts. The breaking point came suddenly. Harold slammed his crystal tumbler down on a nearby table, the sharp crack silencing conversations throughout the room. His face had turned a dangerous shade of red, the veins in his neck protruding as he stepped into the center of his ballroom. "Enough!" His voice boomed across the space. "This is absolutely enough of this absurd theatricality." He turned in a slow circle, addressing the entire room. "Look at yourselves. One song from a Maid, and you're all ready to throw away everything we built. This isn't social justice. This is social hysteria." The room fell into a tense silence. The gathered elite, who moments ago had been eagerly planning change, shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided his gaze, while others straightened their spines, ready for confrontation. Harold pressed his momentary advantage. "You think this is real?" He gestured dismissively toward Lyla. "This performance of humility and wisdom. She's playing you all like instruments, and you're so desperate to absolve yourselves of imaginary guilt that you can't even see it." His words dripped with contempt. "I've watched her type for years, always looking for an angle, an opportunity to climb above their station." James started to step forward, but Lyla raised her hand, stopping him. She moved deliberately toward Harold, her practical shoes clicking against the marble floor. The same quiet dignity that had characterized her performance now radiated from her every movement. "Is that what you think happened here tonight, Mr. Kensington?" Her voice carried clearly, without a trace of fear or subservience. "That I orchestrated all of this? That I somehow manipulated these people into recognizing their humanity?" She stood directly before him now, neither looking up nor down. "You gave me permission to sing, remember? You wanted to humiliate me. Instead, you revealed yourself." Harold's smirk faltered slightly. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I built this fortune. I created thousands of jobs. You inherited your father's company," Lyla interrupted, her voice steady. "I cleaned his office for 2 years before he passed. He told me about your start, the trust fund, the connections, the doors that opened automatically because of your name." She took another step closer. "But that's not even the point. The point is that you're so afraid of losing control that you can't even see what's happening here. The room had become absolutely still. Even the servers had stopped moving, watching the confrontation unfold. Harold looked around desperately for support, for someone to back him up, but found only averted eyes or openly hostile stares. These people, Lyla continued, gesturing to the room, aren't acting out of guilt or manipulation. They're remembering who they wanted to be before people like you convinced them that wealth was the only measure of worth. She paused, letting her words sink in. Your power isn't being taken away, Mr. Kensington. It's being transformed into something better. Harold's composure cracked entirely. Security, he bellowed. I want this woman removed from my property immediately. But the security staff remained motionless, some even shaking their heads slightly. The room began to divide physically, people moving away from Harold, creating a clear separation between him and the rest of the gathering. It wasn't just rejection. It was a visible representation of the power shift that had occurred over the course of the evening. You're all fools, Harold spat, his voice shaking. This little social justice fantasy will last until the first board meeting, the first quarterly report, the first drop in stock prices. Then you'll remember who you really are. Clara stepped forward, her social authority now aligned with a new purpose. No, Harold. We're remembering who we really are right now. And who we are isn't defined by our stock portfolios. She turned to Lyla. Please, continue with what you were saying about the foundation structure. I believe we were discussing community oversight. The deliberate dismissal of Harold's outburst was more devastating than any direct confrontation could have been. As the conversations resumed around him, he stood isolated in his own ballroom, watching his carefully constructed world reorganize itself according to values he had spent a lifetime dismissing. The grand doors of the ballroom swung open with dramatic timing. Marcus Chun, Harold's former business partner from 15 years ago, strode in. His unexpected appearance sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Unlike the other guests in their formal attire, Marcus wore a simple business suit, his silver hair slightly disheveled, carrying a worn leather briefcase. I apologize for the late arrival, Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. But when I heard about what was happening here tonight, I knew it was time. He locked eyes with Harold, who had gone deathly pale. Time for everyone to know the truth about how the great Harold Kensington really built his empire. James stepped forward, legal instincts kicking in. Marcus, you signed a non-disclosure agreement which becomes void in cases of criminal activity. Marcus interrupted, opening his briefcase. Something you helped draft, if I remember correctly, James. He pulled out a stack of documents, their edges worn with age. 15 years ago, Harold didn't just force me out of the company. He orchestrated the systematic destruction of minority-owned businesses across 5 states to build his real estate empire. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Harold lunged forward, but 2 of his own security staff moved to block his path, their loyalty shifting with the tide of revelations. It was all perfectly legal on paper, Marcus continued, spreading documents across a nearby table. Predatory loans, manipulated zoning laws, manufactured health code violations. Harold's genius was making destruction look like development. But I kept records of everything, including the internal memos where he specifically targeted businesses owned by people of color. Lyla watched from her position near the stage, pieces of her own history falling into place. The church where I first sang, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. It was demolished for one of your developments. The entire community was displaced. Exactly, Marcus nodded. Harold didn't just exploit people. He deliberately targeted communities that he thought couldn't fight back. Communities like yours, Lyla. He turned to address the shocked gathering. I've spent 15 years trying to find a way to expose this without violating the legal agreements I signed. But tonight, watching the news of what was happening here spread through our circles, I realized the moment had finally come. Harold's attempt at damage control was immediate. These are lies. Ancient history twisted by a bitter ex-partner. You all know me. You know how I operate dash. Yes, we do, Clara interrupted, her voice ice cold. That's precisely the problem, Harold. We know exactly how you operate. We've just spent decades pretending not to see it. She turned to Marcus. Those documents, are they verifiable? Every page, Marcus confirmed. Bank records, internal communications, shell company structures. I was there for all of it, helping build the very systems I now regret. But here's what matters now. He turned to face Lyla. The properties, the businesses that were destroyed, I've mapped every single one. If this foundation you're building is serious about reparative justice, I'm offering full documentation of everyone who was harmed. The room buzzed with the energy of crisis and opportunity. James had already pulled out his phone, conferring rapidly with other lawyers present. Young tech executives huddled around Marcus's documents, discussing ways to digitize and analyze the data. Clara was organizing an emergency meeting of her social circle's most influential members. Harold watched his carefully constructed world collapse with stunning speed. Each person who stepped forward to examine Marcus's evidence was another pillar of support crumbling beneath him. The very people he had trained to worship power and success were now using those instincts against him. "You're all hypocrites," he snarled, his composure completely shattered. "Everyone in this room has benefited from the same systems you're now condemning. You think your hands are clean?" "No," Lyla responded, her voice carrying the same power it had during her song. "That's exactly what we're acknowledging. No one's hands are clean. But tonight, we're choosing to do something about it." She turned to Marcus. "Those communities you mapped, they're still there. Different names, different buildings, but the same struggles. Your documentation isn't just about the past. It's about understanding exactly what needs to be rebuilt." The energy in the room shifted from shock to determined action. The foundation that had been a nascent idea earlier in the evening now had its first clear mission. The gathered elite, with their networks, resources, and newly awakened consciences, began organizing around a concrete plan for restoration and justice. Through it all, Harold stood increasingly isolated, watching as his own carefully curated guest list transformed into an impromptu coalition for change. The very power structures he had spent a lifetime building were being repurposed before his eyes, turned toward goals he had actively worked to prevent. The grand ballroom, which had begun the evening as a monument to wealth and privilege, now hummed with the energy of revolution. Harold's final desperate attempts to maintain control had backfired spectacularly, leaving him cornered by his own history. "Let me be absolutely clear," the ex-colleague continued, pulling out one final document from his briefcase. "This isn't just about past wrongs. Your company is currently in the final stages of a similar operation in 3 more neighborhoods." He spread out a map marked with red circles. The same tactics, the same targets, just updated for the digital age. Harold lunged for the papers, but his movement was cut short by his own security team. The same men who had spent years following his orders now stood as silent witnesses to his downfall. The irony of this betrayal was not lost on anyone in the room. "You're all so eager to believe the worst," Harold spat, his carefully maintained facade cracking completely. "One night of emotional manipulation, and you throw away decades of business relationships? For what? Some servant song and a bunch of outdated paperwork." Lyla stepped forward, her presence commanding the room's attention without effort. "No, Mr. Kensington, not for a song. For truth. For justice. For all the voices you've spent your life silencing." She turned to address the gathered crowd. "This isn't about one man's crimes. It's about a system that made those crimes not just possible, but profitable. A system that turned all of you into willing accomplices." The room absorbed her words in heavy silence. Clara was the first to move, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling an emergency meeting of the Arts Council Board. We need to redirect funds to rebuilding the cultural spaces that were destroyed." Others followed her lead, their phones emerging like weapons of reconstruction. James stepped forward, legal pad in hand. "We need to move quickly. I propose an immediate freeze on all current development projects pending review. We'll need a task force to examine every transaction, every permit, every zoning change." He looked at Harold. "And yes, old friend, that means your entire empire is about to be dissected." The young tech billionaire who had earlier discussed blockchain raised his hand. "I can have a team working on a database by morning. We'll track every displacement, every closed business, every community impact, full transparency, accessible to everyone affected. Harold watched in mounting horror as his carefully constructed world was systematically dismantled. Each person who stepped forward with an offer of help or expertise was another brick pulled from his foundation of power. The very skills and connections he had cultivated in these people were now being turned toward his destruction. "You don't understand what you're doing," he tried one last time, his voice hoarse. "The economic implications, the jobs at stake, the dash, the human cost?" Lyla interrupted. "The families displaced? The communities destroyed? The lives derailed?" "Yes, Mr. Kensington. For the first time, people in this room are beginning to understand exactly what's at stake." She turned to the crowd. "This isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. About using power to heal instead of harm." The eve. Ning had become a pivot point, a moment when the machinery of wealth and privilege began to turn in a new direction. Plans were being made, committees formed, resources allocated. The very efficiency that had made these people successful in business was now being applied to dismantling the systems they had helped build. Clara approached Lyla, tears in her eyes but steel in her voice. "Your song opened our eyes, but your courage is showing us the way forward. Will you help us? Not as a symbol or a token, but as a leader, someone who truly understands what needs to be done." The room held its breath, waiting for Lyla's response. She looked around at the gathered faces, seeing past their expensive clothes and cultivated manners to the awakening humanity beneath. "Yes," she said finally, "but on one condition. This can't be about making ourselves feel better. It has to be about real change, sustainable change, change that outlives this moment of enlightenment." As agreements were made and commitments solidified, Harold stood alone, watching his empire crumble. But in the debris of his fallen kingdom, something new was taking root. Something built not on exploitation and fear, but on justice and hope. His attempt to humiliate a servant had instead sparked a transformation that would ripple far beyond this single evening, far beyond these gilded walls. The night that began with a song was ending with a revolution, not of violence or destruction, but of awakening and reconstruction. And in the center of it all stood Lyla, her voice now carrying not just music, but the promise of change, real, lasting change, that would reshape not just one man's empire, but the very foundations of power itself.